Okay, so 5 minutes have passed, and I believe that it's safe to start with our panel, which is the last panel in a long series of panels. So congratulations to all of you who still have enough stamina in you to stay for another, hopefully interesting 90 minutes of conversation. To say immediately that unfortunately this is the only manual that we have at the Belgrade Security Forum. There is no way around it. We will simply take the blame, or I will simply take the blame and hopefully move on from here. Why we have decided to introduce this particular topic? Well, first of all, I believe that we share the opinion that this is one of the most important bilateral relationships in modern world that affects this region, but also affects the whole of Europe and, of course, global relations and international security. And also because we have been granted as Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence the unique opportunity to partner with the German Marshall Fund and the Garmisch Center for European Security Studies with the support of the Balkan Trust for Democracy on a project that is called Balkans 360. It's not only a project, it is also a wider initiative that aims to increase the understanding between both United States and Germany and other or all principal actors when it comes to most pressing challenges in the region of Western Balkans, and I would add wider Southeast Europe. This is the first in a series of events, and Dr. Michta will kindly, I believe, reference to the aims and following events within this initiative. This is, of course, another distinguished panel, and I have the privilege to moderate the conversation and welcome two ambassadors. Firstly, His Excellency, Ambassador Karl Scott, Ambassador of the United States to the Republic of Serbia, His Excellency Thomas Schieb, Ambassador of Federal Republic of Germany to the Republic of Serbia, and finally the Dean of the George Marshall Center, Dr. Andrew Michta. I wanted to read most important excerpts from your biographies, but they are quite long, and to me all seemed so important that that would probably take another 10 minutes of our time. What I would like to say is that yesterday we heard in a very inspiring speech Professor McGinty speaking of reading World War II memoirs as his guilty pleasure. Being a history buff myself and under the influence of dear colleagues and our long discussions in the office, I wanted to know more of different periods of German modern history. One of these periods, which followed one of the darkest times, was the post-war period, when German economic miracle was made possible, among other things, by American hard power and the security umbrella it provided. Now, this is an audience that knows history well, of course, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But there was this notion of a liberal order in international relations, of which an important part, a pillar, was the transatlantic partnership, one with the UK and another coming even more to the fore in the 21st century between the United States and Germany. I would also argue that there is a mutual interest, fascination, attraction even. Berlin, for instance, being discovered and rediscovered as one of the centers of Europe, not only in politics. Yet Germany has also been seen in the international arena as a sort of a reluctant hegemon, to use an expression by a British author, unsure of whether it should be more assertive. Recently, we have also witnessed disagreements, just to mention defense spending or politics towards China, but also some areas of alignment, for instance, the regime towards Russia. Which takes me to this region. Many of the issues that have been covered already by our program, the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, is there a way forward for Bosnia? We discussed the current situation and deadlock in Macedonia, one of actually the reason why we will not be able, after all, to welcome Prime Minister Zaev tomorrow in our program. All speaks of a fragile and I wouldn't necessarily say unstable region, but definitely a region that still seeks stability. Part of the reasoning behind the Balkan 360 project was this need for reassessment and thinking of a new comprehensive, arguably joint approach by the United States and Germany to this region. With that said, I would like to offer to our distinguished panelists the opportunity to provide introductory remarks. They're supposed to be short, and then we will follow on with questions. Ambassador Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and for laying out the basic picture of how you'd like to see this session go forward. I think that there's a lot of focus on differences, but in fact I'd like to focus on the commonalities and similarities between the United States approach and the approach of our European allies, and that would include also of Germany. The United States, I think, has been pretty consistent over the last 2 decades, ever since the fall of Milosevic regime, in focusing on this region and seeking a reconciliation. First, having the countries reconcile with their history and the violent conflict of the 1990s, but also then reconcile with their neighbors and move forward in building a future that would be founded on dynamic economic growth in the countries of the region and in strong, vibrant democracies that were based and anchored in the rule of law and supported by a free media. All of this would help these countries, but also the key element of this was the process of integration into the European Union as the leitmotif of this reform effort throughout the 2000s and this last decade. And we did so not just with rhetoric, with words, but in deeds. In the last 17 years, the United States has provided over $1 billion in assistance here in Serbia alone. And this assistance has been aimed at exactly supporting these sorts of directions, at helping to develop. Yes, we built roads and we supported hospitals and provided medical equipment, but much of the focus has been focused on building an efficient and effective judiciary and police based upon rule of law, on combating corruption and organized crime, on making governance here in Serbia accessible to the average citizen, whether that be at the municipal level with support for cities around this country in developing one-stop shops for citizens on their average needs with the municipality, all the way up to the federal level through e-governance reforms and other steps which have helped make the Serbian government more effective, but also more transparent. We've provided support to entrepreneurs, to business development, to to young business people and IT experts through incubators. We've helped support programs to help build a vibrant civil society. We've trained journalists and provided support to freedom of the media. So all of those steps have been aimed at reaching one goal. When we look at the process of reconciliation, however, and we look at the key concerns in the region, the other thing I'd like to say is that whatever support we might give, and I think that our programs have very much dovetailed with the programs of the European Union and with bilateral programs by European countries, including by Germany. But none of the sort of reforms and steps that we are calling for can be imposed by the outside. They have to be adopted by the leaders of this region, sometimes through courageous steps, especially in the reconciliation process, but not just by the leaders who want to drive the process, but also by the people of the countries of this region who need to want this far more than we from the outside want it. And I think that while the strategic goals of the governments in this region are all towards integration into the European Union, and for those who want it, also integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions, including NATO, we've seen only halting progress in many of these areas. Progress halting perhaps because these are difficult issues, no question about it, but also because it requires more courage by the leaders of the region and more commitment by the people of the region to support their leaders in this process. But in the end, I remain still optimistic by where the region's going. Our country is still committed to this overarching viewpoint, and that's what we intend to see as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So nothing can be imposed, only internalized. That is something that we also heard today. Ambassador Schieb, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also we say I'm really honored to be here. I only arrived in Belgrade a couple of weeks ago and now participating in this distinguished security forum. Maybe to start, I think also Germany's policy vis-à-vis the Western Balkans has been very, very consistent. I think our overall objective goal was very clear from the start. We are supporting stability, peace and prosperity in the Western Balkans, and we think that Euro integration is the right path to go. Now, of course, this makes a very difficult, no doubt, transformation process or processes necessary in all the respective countries. I have to say that we are closely cooperating since decades even, with our EU partners, with our transatlantic partners, so in a very, very consistent way. I myself was quite impressed when arriving in Belgrade that we are really of course we are supporting this country on its way towards the European Union, but we are also extremely active in terms of economic cooperation. All our political foundations are here and are also active in other countries of the Western Balkans. Yeah? So, as was said by my American colleague, of course it's up to the leaders, the political leaders, to give guidance and show political courage and also make maybe difficult political decisions. But at the same time, it's extremely important also to have the public, the people on board. So you have to follow a broad approach to support democracy, rule of law, freedom of media. This is, of course, of the essence. indeed, we have made a lot of progress, or the countries have made a lot of progress. It is difficult, and I think this is also what this is all about, how to overcome the current problems or challenges. But again, I would say Germany has been very consistent, and the Western Balkans always has been and still is clearly a priority of the German government.
Thank you. So Germany consistent policy towards Western Balkans and close cooperation for decades, not only with US but also with European Union partners. Dr. Michta, please. If you will.
Yes, thank you, Marko, for inviting me, Excellencies. I'm honored to be on this panel, and thank you for showing up this late for our conversation here. First, let me begin by passing along the greetings from General Dayton, our director at the Marshall Center, and General Berger, our German deputy director. As some of you probably know, the Marshall Center is a German-American partnership. We're the only center within the Defense Department structure. There are 5 regional centers. That's truly international. Our German partners contribute to the budget, they contribute staff, they contribute faculty, they contribute guidance, and so this is really a unique partnership that has been in place now for 25 years, since the end of the Cold War, where the German and the American experts work together. That's in terms of context, and now why Balkans 360. 2 reasons. We are celebrating this year a 25th anniversary of the center. We've been doing this for 25 years. What that means is that over time we have developed an alumni base. The total number of Marshall Center alumni, people who take part in our regional courses and our transnational courses, who participate in community of interest event, are now over 13,000. And a lot of them, over time, remember we're talking about 25 years, have reached important positions of prominence in their respective governments. For this region, we have over 2,000 alumni, some of them very senior in your respective governments and media and public policy life. So this idea was born of the notion that maybe we should come to this with a couple of very fundamental assumptions. One of them is that this needs to be a bilateral German-American effort. We're the 2 principal allies, we're the most important drivers, the 2 countries, when it comes to promoting European integration, transnational integration. And at the same time, we have the tool, if you will, in the form of the Marshall Center that is German-American by definition. We also wanted to connect this to the NGO community. So we reached out to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and we are going to be signing an MOU with GMF in Berlin on the 24th of October to launch the Balkans 360 as an official project. I was supposed to be sharing the stage here with either Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who is the Vice President of GMF and head of the Berlin office, or Jan Teschau, who is their senior fellow working on European issues. Unfortunately, they've both been struck by illness, and so I am here trying to take up the slack, doing as best I can in their absence. So we wanted to be bilateral. We wanted to leverage our alumni group. We don't want to go into a setting where we talk about the region. We want to converse with the region. We want to discuss the issues of how to establish cooperative projects across the region with people who have the capacity to, A, give us insights, and then we, through our own channels, both on the policy side and the NGO side, hopefully will be able to make recommendations on how to act on them. Second point is we come into this with the assumption that we need innovative engagement. We want to try things that maybe we're overlooking. We want to hear from people who may have great ideas and for some reason have not been able to come, get through into the policy community. We come to this also with the assumption, this is the third core assumption, that there is real capacity for cooperative effort in the region. I know it's a hard sell to say that sometimes because of all the political friction that you hear about, and I'm not a Balkan expert, full disclosure, but I have some outstanding faculty who work on the Balkans. One of them, Dr. Zanelli, just walked in here, so I will draw on her if need be if you ask me something too difficult. What are we planning is the following. We've already had a major senior alumni event in Garmisch where we announced that we're going to be building this project. On the 24th of October in Berlin, we're meeting with GMF. Karen Donfried, who is the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, will be flying in. General Dayton will be coming in from our side. We'll officially sign an MOU between our two organizations. But most importantly, we will have a very intense day-long workshop-like discussion that will involve senior U.S. civilian and military representatives, senior German civilian and military representatives, people from the NGO community, people from the policy community, trying to set the agenda of what we should be focusing on. And remember, we want to focus on what we call low-hanging fruit. We're not even presuming that we'll be able to address grand strategic issues, but we believe that cooperative engagement starts at the grassroots and moves up from there, and I think we can do quite a bit in that regard. We will follow up with our first major event in Garmisch-Partenkirchen on the 29th and the 30th of November. So only six weeks after we have met in Berlin. And in contrast to our conversation in Berlin, where we're framing the project, this will be driven predominantly by people from the region. So we'll be reaching out to our alumni. We'll be reaching out to some of you here as well to bring you in. And Marko, whose institute is partnering with GMF, is very intimately involved in our planning process, and I'm very grateful for all the work you have done on that. The third step that we hope, based on what we generate from our Garmisch meeting, is to have a meeting in March somewhere in the region. We have not yet set on a country, but we believe that if we are to talk about the region, we should also have this conversation in the region. And I think there's a real value from the point of view of strengthening American-German engagement in the Balkans to actually come to the region with this project, not just have it done outside like in Germany or in the United States or in other venues that this may develop into. We will then hopefully, this is the intent of the German Marshall Fund, we will present our findings not only through our respective channels within the German and American governments, but also in a report that we will release at the GMF Brussels Forum next year, and also we will have a special Balkans 360 event here in Belgrade, I hope as part of the Belgrade Forum. I'm very excited about this project. As I said, I'm not an expert on the Balkans, but I have, I believe, one of the strongest teams that I've ever worked with. We have full support of GMF on this. We have full buy-in from the US and German governments in terms of supporting this initiative. And because of our connectivity with GMF, we are hoping to build a very unique blend of people who will be part of this conversation. We will have the governmental side engaged from the German and American side. We will have one of the premier think tanks, the GMF, engaged from the NGO side. And we will have, most importantly, the core of this discussion, which will be our alumni in the region, people from across the Balkans who will be giving us new insights, I hope, maybe something that we haven't seen yet. So that's the outline. Stay tuned. We will be releasing updates on what we're doing. We will be updating you on what we're hoping to achieve going forward. And if you have any great ideas, the gentleman who is sitting here at the end, Marko, is the right person to come to and make suggestions. He will relay them to us immediately. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for that. And I will ask you more about the low-hanging fruit as seen by some of your alumni. But I would like to turn the table now and actually give to our audience what they arguably came here for. And that is, I would like to hear from you, Dr. Michta, your assessment of the state of this transatlantic partnership today and the actual mood in Germany when it comes to relations between Washington and Berlin.
Okay, since you're putting me on the spot to offer analysis for what it's worth, let me first preface this by saying that whatever I say in these comments are my private views as a scholar and analyst. I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government or the Marshall Center or the Defense Department, or my wife for that matter. I'm speaking here in my exclusive capacity as a private individual. I've sat through a number of fora like this, most recently in Tallinn, the Lennart Meri Forum, Prague, at a conference that the Foreign Ministry organized. And the question that Marko just posed is one that comes up very often. friction, discord, why are things moving the way they're moving? My answer has always been, don't listen to what people say, look at what we do. The German-American relationship remains the core, the foundation of transatlantic security. Not only are you talking about the greatest players in terms of the size of our economies, but even in terms of geostrategic requirements. Germany is the principal entry point for U.S. forces into Europe, period. Without Germany, there is no largest strategic concept for NATO, for security, for providing for outreach for things that we're doing. And conversely, without the United States fully engaged in Europe, there is no long-term security. There is no guarantee that deterrence will hold and that security competition in Eurasia will remain suppressed and will not escalate into a conflict. So if you look at what we are doing, we're increasing our military presence in Europe. I'll tell you a personal aspect of this. Last year we had Defense Minister von der Leyen and Secretary of Defense Mattis hold a bilateral meeting at the Marshall Center. At the end of that meeting, I was very proud of this, they called the center a strategic instrument of policy implementation. But also what was absolutely obvious was how strong that bilateral relationship was. I haven't counted, I think they've met about 18 times so far. We are working at the mill level, we're working at the political level. Tune out a lot of the noise would be my message. And in the age of social media, the echo chamber that keeps amplifying this, and especially the kind of proclivity to focus on the negative and not look at the strategic underpinnings of the German-American relationship or US-European relationship, broadly speaking, is something that we should really keep in mind. And the second point I want to make, so that I don't sound Pollyannish here, look, Europe is in flux. There are a lot of unanswered questions. The questions about how the European Union will eventually evolve. There are various ideas and concepts on the table, and I think this is very relevant and important to your region, because you are, I think, still very much tracking for membership in the European Union, and some of the countries from the regions are already in NATO. That's a very important development. I've been working on NATO enlargement since the 1990s, and as I said, I'm not a regional specialist on the Balkans, and I have seen firsthand how important enlargement has been, both from the NATO perspective and the EU perspective. It stabilized the region, it has created good governance patterns, it has set norms, and it has really modernized and professionalized the military forces of the post-Soviet states. So a lot has changed. I mean, 5 years ago, Europe was whole and free and at peace, right? A lot of scholars and academics assumed that we were on the trajectory of rule-based international order. Well, Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea. There's an ongoing war in eastern Ukraine. State-on-state competition, if you even look at our founding documents, national security strategy, or there's I think a 12-page national defense strategy, declassified document that Secretary Mattis released at Hopkins. We are in a different world. We are in a world where great power competition is playing an ever greater role. But it is precisely because of that that I argue we need each other. And people who make strategy, who make key policy decisions understand that. So not to speak too long, my answer, Marko, would be tune out the noise. Don't listen to what you hear on the social media circuit. Look at what we're doing in terms of adding resources. The Europeans are stepping up on defense. Is the world perfect? No. Are we in a better shape than we were before? I would argue absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, proclivity towards the negative, I have written that down. Very, very interesting. I would like then to take us further with this and ask Ambassador Scott. So this is a new world, according to Secretary Mattis. And if there is a new geopolitical reality, I mean, and this has been the case probably since 2014, as many are saying, how does it influence Serbia and Western Balkans? Ambassador Scott, in your view.
Thank you. I think that's a very good and valid question. First, I'd say actually the shift in geopolitics may even be a little bit older than just 2014, because we also saw the Russian invasion of South Ossetia, the recognition of independence for Abkhazia, and then, of course, Ukraine. All three overt actions. We've also seen an increasing emphasis and increasing activity by Russia more on the covert side in efforts to exploit fissions within our own countries, within our own societies in the West, in order to weaken our societies and weaken our political will to continue to move forward. So our approach is to focus very much, first and foremost, on our key allies and partners and shoring up and strengthening the Western alliance. And a lot of effort and some noise has gone into the entire idea of helping to strengthen the Western alliance, because realistically speaking, in addressing many of the challenges in the world, for the United States, where are our other partners going to be? First and foremost, they're going to be in those who share our values, those who share the economic, but also the political capabilities to engage, and that's Europe. Similarly, I think for a European Union seeking to become more active on the world stage, when they look around for partners, the first and most natural partner for them is in the United States of America. So continuing to build and strengthen those partnerships is a key area. So that means making sure that our cooperation with the European Union is strong, that NATO remains a bedrock of the security cooperation, and there's been a lot of focus put on that, and I think there has been success in seeing the European countries begin to step up more and share that burden a little bit more. But I think the thing I'd like to emphasize here in this room is that for us, Western Europe, or the Western Alliance, isn't just about the EU and NATO. It also includes the Western Balkans, which we consider naturally to be a part of this region. And that's why we've been such a consistent champion of integration for the countries of the Western Balkans into Euro-Atlantic institutions, because this sort of integration builds resilience among the countries. It helps to strengthen those societies, but it builds their resilience also to resist malign activities. Our vision for the Western Balkans, and I think the European Union's vision for the Western Balkans, is a positive one. I'm not sure that Moscow's vision is a positive one. It's more of a negative one. It's to stop things from happening. It's to bring countries down, to weaken them, in that geopolitical struggle, at least make them more malleable to Russia's point of views. It's a negative agenda, and we're pursuing this positive agenda. We think that it helps benefit us through greater peace and stability in Europe, but also significantly benefits the countries of this region. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Schieb, would you like to follow up on that question?
So our approach vis-à-vis the Western Balkans, and as I said in the beginning, the Western Balkans is a priority of the German government. Objective, peace, stability, and prosperity. If you ask, well, is it true that the Western Balkans is still the priority? Definitely. One has to say that, coming from New York, that in this time of seemingly ever increasing international conflicts and issues, but also an increasingly active role of Germany on the international stage, I think Germany simply has more on its plate, and has maybe more priorities, but the Western Balkans still remains a priority. And maybe just to give you a few very concrete examples, in this September, 4 members of the German government traveled to Skopje to support the process, hopefully supporting this name agreement. The Chancellor was there, the Foreign Minister was there, who then visited Tirana, the Defense Minister, the Europe Minister, who then continued to Belgrade. So, and also our financial engagement is significant. Just to give a few examples, since 2008, we are supporting a specific program called the Stability Pact in the Western Balkan countries. We have been, it's mostly about strengthening civil society, fostering human rights, media freedom, as well as reconciliation. And another example, which is, I think, very important, the Berlin process launched in 2014 by Chancellor Marko. And this has become a brand that stands for increasing regional cooperation in the Western Balkans. The last conference in August was in London, and the next in 2019 will be in Poland. So we also think that a prospering, stable, peaceful Western Balkans region is best in the best interest for Europe. And I mean, the EU is a direct neighbor and is directly affected by all developments happening here. And we believe that EU accession is the way to finally achieve kind of a sustainable peace and sustainable prosperity in which societies can thrive. So this is why, indeed, the European perspective is extremely important, which was confirmed by the EU Western Balkans Summit in May. Yeah, maybe, but again, I mean, I mentioned this in the beginning. Of course, this accession process is a difficult one, and there cannot be any so-called discounts. So there are clear conditions which need to be fulfilled, because if not, we might kind of incorporate import problems, which we then have to resolve. So it's important to resolve these problems before entering the club. So this is why it's important to have democratic procedures, good governance, rule of law, media freedom. Simply, they are the backbones of resilient and prosperous society.
I have to ask you one more thing. I mean, there's this constant issue of leadership. We like to talk about leadership. How do you look at this concept? I mean, is this something that Germany is comfortable with? Being a leader on reforms, because many are looking, and I recently, a colleague of mine, Jelena Volic-Helbuš, and myself, we co-wrote a paper stating how influence of Germany in Serbia is arguably almost without precedent in recent or more modern history of this country, and it's manifold, and it's very interesting, and there are many positives about it. But how do Germans perceive leadership as such?
I mean, leadership in general, yes. So the international, worldwide.
Yes.
Of course, a very interesting question, but a question which has been kind of been asked in the last couple of years quite frequently. And I mean, I have to say, I have already quite a, I mean, I started in 1992, I think Germany has come a long way. Yeah, so, I think Germany is always kind of in cooperation with partners, of course, knows that we have, because of our, well, of our size in the middle of Europe, a certain international responsibility. 82 million people, economically doing very well, closely linked, integrated in the transatlantic partnership, an important player in the European Union. So, of course, we have a lot of international responsibility, and I think increasingly over the years, Germany, I think, has never actively sought this role. Yeah? So. But if you look at financial crisis in Europe. If you look at, which was mentioned already, Ukraine, where I think Germany with our French partners also assumed a certain kind of leadership role in terms of migration, something again which we didn't seek. So things were just, challenges were coming to us and we had to respond, knowing that also we had to lead and to give guidance. But always, I mean, we are realists and we are not going it alone. It is always clear we are a reliant member of the European Union, a steadfast transatlantic partner, but of course we hope to be a partner in leadership, and I think we've made quite a lot of headway in the last couple of years.
Thank you. Dr. Michta, you were referring to this low-hanging fruit. I heard you using that expression before. You have, as you said, 1,300, if I heard that correctly, alumni in this region alone.
2,000.
2,000 in this region alone. So that's a tremendous resource. Those people occupy all sorts of positions. So when you talk with them, when your faculty staff talks with them, what do they see as long-hanging fruit in this region?
That's an excellent question, and we actually have written up a small report based on our first event that's available on our website if you want to take a look at it. But there were several issues that our alumni expressed the biggest concern over. First, the most important message we got was that they're in full support of this German-American project, the Balkans 360, the effort to actually go into the region, re-engage, and listen very carefully to what the possible paths going forward might be. Economic issues were raised quite frequently, and I think quite correctly. I mean, prosperity, nothing helps attenuate ethnic competition, whatever disagreements you may have, than the sense that there is economic growth, that there is opportunity in the region. Here the record is not that good, as you know, across the Western Balkans. So concerns over bringing more foreign direct investment, concern over reducing unemployment, concern over especially reducing youth unemployment, which is quite high. We don't have any magic wand for that, but the important thing is that if you look at the region, just like you look across Europe, over the past 3 decades, because of the rise of China, the growing influence of China, all across the globe, it's not just in Europe, you see this in Australia, you see this in South America and Asia Pacific in particular, and also other players. There is a sense that creating a larger destiny for the European states, and that includes this region as well, and a sense of conviction that things are achievable, is going to have a tremendous impact on how this region will be evolving. Remember also when I mentioned in the very beginning that Europe is in flux, when Brexit is completed, the second largest economy in the European Union will be leaving. And it's also the economy that's not part of the Eurozone, which means right now the portion of the EU GDP that's not in the euro currency, not in the Eurozone, is about 32, 33%. With the Brits gone, that will drop to about 10, 11% maybe. So the kind of impulse for integration, just the economic pressures that are going to build to come as close as possible to this economic core, which is around the euro. And the biggest country that's at the center of that is obviously Germany. I had a very clear sense in a number of conversations with our alumni that they're keenly aware of the fact that if you don't get on that train as it's moving in that direction, you may be left outside. So economic growth, continued change in how institutions function to stop any backsliding, and the ability to work cooperatively. And I know it's very hard to say this in the Balkans. It's very hard to say it globally, let's all cooperate. It sounds almost naive. But remember that we are now almost 3 decades away from the Balkan Wars. And if you look at the amount of progress that the region has made, it is stunning. Who would have predicted that you would have several member states from the region that are already members of the NATO alliance? I mean, that is huge. And if you look at how post-communist transitions took place in former Eastern Europe, it was never conditional that you first join NATO and then you get into the EU, but there was a de facto two-step. You were moving in that direction, and then you were moving because you were incorporated in the existing normative structures of the collective West. So what I hope to achieve with 360, and we're working very hard at that, is to identify what specific projects we can actually engage in the region to make that cooperative spirit, reignited and restarted.
Yes, and thank you for that. But there is also something that has been, I'd say, prevailing yesterday, was this kind of a criticism of European Union or European perspective, actually, as this vague term. I mean, some of the countries have been transitioning. Of course, I mean, when you look at the state of war where we were 25, 30 years ago, of course, there's tremendous progress. But then there is also the issue of transitioning for decades towards something. That is another concern, because it seems, especially, and after listening to this morning's speeches, especially speech of Serbian president, that there is a sort of a lack of perceived trust between Western Balkans and the European Union. Do you feel that this is the case? Perhaps, I'm looking at Ambassador Scott, but maybe this is a question for Ambassador Schieb.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, of course. I mean, it is. It would be disappointing. So, if this European perspective is not giving kind of is not kind of generating a kind of willingness, interest, maybe even euphoria in societies, and then the question is why. Yeah. But I mean, I think the European perspective is very, very clear, and I don't want there are 35 chapters which need to be opened, then they are being negotiated, then eventually they are closed, and these are the conditions to be fulfilled in order to become member of the European Union. And of course, it's important that this process. I mean, you have to take your time. It's extremely difficult. Of course, the transformation processes which have to be conducted, and of course, it's in our interest, to keep the momentum. So, and having arrived here only recently, but this is really a personal remark. Yes, you can ask yourself, but is it true? And if so, why? But I wouldn't say it's vague. I think the European perspective is a very concrete one. And yes, we are 28 members now. We have a number of countries which relatively recently did undergo these processes successfully. And of course, then you can argue, well, look at the current state of the European Union. It's also kind of having its problems, and it's challenged. And indeed, no one would doubt that there's also urgent need for internal reform. But this should not. For us, it's kind of. It doesn't exclude itself. Yeah? On the one hand, EU reform is definitely necessary, and I think everybody agrees, and we have started and will start working on that. And on the other, and the second track is the enlargement process, which is of strategic importance for the European Union. And there we have clear conditions, and again, I can talk on behalf of the German embassy here, and I think my EU colleagues would probably would agree with me. We are here to support Serbia on its way, and in a very constructive, kind of uplifting mood, but in a very kind of frank, open, but always constructive relationship.
Thank you for that word, uplifting. Ambassador Scott, please.
If I could just say a couple of words. One of the big ironies about American policy is we have always been a huge fan of the EU enlargement process. And I at least am firmly convinced that the European Union has probably been the most powerful force for peaceful transition in my lifetime, in which they've truly changed an entire continent and made the idea of conflict on this continent much less likely, and for many even inconceivable. And that's a hugely important role and record. So we've always been a supporter of EU enlargement, supported enlargement into this region as well. There are times when Americans, I think, get a little bit frustrated with the bureaucratic process of 35 chapters and cucumber regulations and those things that all have to be part and parcel of joining the European Union. We'd like to see a more strategic approach taken by the European Union, and that's why we've in fact seen, as Dr. Michta mentioned before, this NATO-EU two-step, where the NATO has been a little bit quicker to bring in countries and integrate them into a transatlantic family, and the European Union has been always a little bit slower. I think some of the frustrations here in Serbia and in the rest of the region are that the process is long, it's complicated. The feeling that the bar gets higher with every new round of enlargement, that the demands being placed upon countries in the Balkans may actually be higher than the demands which were placed on the new members who came in before them. But I can also say that having served also in a previous candidate country which then did get into the European Union, they always complain about the process. They always complain about how long it takes. But in the process of transforming their own societies, their own political situation, their judicial branches, their economies, to meet the acquis of the European Union, they have also transformed their societies for the better. And I believe very much, and has been stated by many of the leaders of Serbia here as well, that whether or not this country or other countries in the Balkans get into the European Union, the process of trying to meet those criteria will make all of these countries more successful for the future. So we remain a big fan of the process. We believe that it's critical for the region. We hope that people don't become so frustrated with it that they give up hope. But also have to say that the perspective remains there. The European Union recommitted to it at their Western Balkans summit. But it does require countries of the region to take steps forward. And I think the latest reports by the European Commission on the candidate countries, including here in Serbia, highlighted a number of areas where there's still a lot of progress to be made.
Thank you. Well, Overregulation actually started with Charlemagne. There's this fantastic show by an Australian historian on History Channel where he refers to that cucumber example and actually takes the Charlemagne as an example of overregulation some 1,200 years ago. I would like to follow this up with another question. And I wanted to say that actually, of course, it's not that only states are impatient. It's citizens as well. Citizens are the ones impatient, first and foremost with their respective elites that they have elected, which you are well aware of. But after having in view all that we have heard so far, where could these new or refocused US-German initiatives now make the greatest difference? Dr. Michta, first you.
I really think that the most important part of what we do is to build a network of people who talk to each other. We always say at the Marshall Center that our mission is about building a network, operationalizing the network, and then the question is to achieve what. In the case of the Balkans 360, it is to achieve cross-connectivity in the region. Politicians who are at the very top may find it difficult sometimes to take positions that are unpopular, that require a lot of pressure to actually make them happen. They're always in the electoral cycles, and they're always working and speaking to different constituencies. This is true about our own democracy. It's true about any state, any democratic state out there. Where we believe we can be most effective is to build a cross-cutting network of people across the region who will be able to actually start addressing these difficult issues that are on the table and then come up with solutions that can percolate to the top. I think that's, if I were to put in a nutshell, if I understand what you're driving at, I think that's the greatest potential added value of what Marshall Center can do. And because our alumni are literally across the bandwidth of every single country that we've worked with, because remember, when people first come to the Marshall Center, they're sent by their governments. It's not an organization that you apply to as a student because you want to come. So they come in usually at the kind of lower middle level of their career, and then as they progress, they come to additional courses, come as Marshall Center research scholars, community of interest events, and they build a network and connectivity that's already there. Every time they're in Garmisch or we do a community of interest event, downrange, we can see that. But what's important is to operationalize that network in the region, not to force any sort of preconceived ideas from our end. I spent a lot of time in think tanks before I went back into government. I have to tell you that I grow weary sometimes when I'm in DC, or as of late, since this is my second tour in Germany, I'm more often in Berlin than I'm in DC, that usually get the same collection of voices that are coming out to speak on the issues. It's useful. That means that you maintain continuity in the dialogue with people in the region. But I sometimes also wonder why some other voices that are probably able to offer something new are not brought into the conversation, and we hope to do that. We hope to be very selective. We'll be very balanced in what we do. We're not here to, pursue one or another country's agenda. This is a strictly regional approach. That's why we say Balkans 360, meaning that we want to cover the entire spectrum of the region and be responsive to the needs and requirements of our participants from across the entire region. We're not here to advocate for an individual country, in other words. We're here to facilitate networking across the bandwidth.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question on brain drain and the issue of labor migration and circular migration, because it is I believe that we will all agree, more or less, that this is a burning issue that needs to be addressed, that it should have been addressed yesterday, immediately, like right now. And we are hopeful we will have tomorrow a conversation with the Prime Minister, and one of the questions will be actually what are the concrete plans to help some of the people who are talented, who have potential to stay and use that potential in this country and not some other. However, I would like to stop here, if we all agree, and open the floor for your questions. I can see only 2 hands. Hopefully others will be encouraged. And the third one over there. So first, question here, then it's Kurt, and then it's Mladen. Please. Just state your name and affiliation.
Yes, thank you. My name is Natalie Nugared. I'm with The Guardian, and I'm also a council member of the ECFR think tank. I wanted to ask you about the scenario that is much discussed in the region, which is a discussion to reach a deal on that would include a territorial exchange between Serbia and Kosovo. I understand, and we've seen public statements, that Germany is not in favor of this scenario, and I understand, and we've seen also public statements, that the American administration is in favor of this scenario. So I wanted to ask Ambassador Schieb, is Germany's hostility to this idea a question of absolute principle, that it should not happen ever? Or do you consider that it's not a priority, that other steps need to be taken before people go down that possible road? And to Ambassador Scott, I'd like to ask you, Can you explain why the US is apparently so in favor of this scenario? And do you not see some of the risks, and how do you address the comments that are made about the risks, especially the notion of opening a Pandora's box across the Balkans if this redrawing of borders happens? Thank you very much.
Would you like to answer immediately, or should we collect the other two questions? Immediately? Ambassador Scott? Please.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think thanks for the question. It doesn't come totally unexpected, but I think it actually has been discussed a couple of times even today. And for me now to respond and to tell you never ever would be asking a bit too much. So who am I? I only can say, yes, indeed, we do not think that this land swap idea is a good one. We have strong opposition. I mean, I think no need to repeat all the arguments. You mentioned Pandora's box, and we also think it's somehow drawing the lines along ethnic criteria, ethnic lines is also in contradiction of what we finally would like to achieve. Welcoming the countries in the EU family, which is multi-ethnic, etc. So then, and you have precedents and its impacts way far beyond this region. And even if we might seemingly solve one problem, we might create many more. And so, yes, we do not think that this is a good idea. This is it.
Thank you. First, let me kind of start by, I got myself in trouble doing this a couple days ago, but correcting the premise of your question. The United States is not in favor of border adjustments or border changes or whatever it is. The U.S. view is that for any agreement between Belgrade and Pristina to be durable, it has to come from the parties to the negotiations themselves. We have to leave it to their political leaders to develop an agreement that is comprehensive, that sets the future course for these two countries, and that can be implemented, and that they, as political leaders, believe that they can gain the support of their populations behind the program. So what we're saying is not this or that. In fact, we're saying we are waiting for you all to develop it. We want to give you the space that you need to develop it. And as part of that process, we are not setting preconditions in advance. We are not drawing red lines to say that this or that is unacceptable for us. But at the same time, we have told the leaders of both sides very clearly that there is no blank check from the United States, that we are not saying whatever you come up with will be great for us. We want to see what they can work out. We will take a look at it and see how we can support it, or if we can support it. So that's actually the policy that we're engaged in. We do very much see the risks involved, but I also see risks involved in not doing anything. The status quo also has risks, and not just the risks of a frozen conflict, as many people say. There are risks in the current status quo, instabilities and tensions, which could lead to a renewal of conflict in this region. And I think we have to weigh options also against the risks of doing nothing right now. So while I have sympathy for those who talk about the concerns of opening a Pandora's box, I also say that this is not the 1990s anymore. From the United States perspective, we are talking about an agreement between two sovereign nations, and they can reach their agreement as they see fit, and we should be ready to look at it. John Bolton, in his statement, which got a lot of press, said very clearly that we will wait for them to present an agreement, but he also finds it difficult to imagine that if it's an agreement that both Belgrade and Pristina can live with, that we as outside parties would say that's totally unacceptable to us. And frankly, I think that much of the same goes for other members of the international community. If it is one which the parties to the conflict find acceptable to themselves, there's almost an inherent bias to look positively on it as a resolution to the issue, unless we see that, in fact, it would lead to problems that are beyond those countries. But as long as an agreement reached out builds stability and normal relations between Belgrade and Pristina, but also doesn't open up other instabilities elsewhere, I expect that we, but I expect also others from the international community, will look positively upon it.
Thank you. Ambassador Schieb, you wanted to follow up on that.
Just very briefly, just to make clear, of course, Germany is also not for the status quo. Of course, what we also would like to achieve or support achieving is a comprehensive agreement between the two parties. And there is the normalization dialogue, and this is an instrument, so to say, and we think there are still many, many issues to be discussed, to be solved, to be implemented. There's no status quo, comprehensive agreement, but really, really very strong reservations against this land swap idea.
Good evening. Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council. That's a good predicate to the question I want to ask, and I want to follow on what you had said, Marko, about the fact that the Wirtschaftswunder was enabled by the stability provided by the United States. We haven't had that stability in the Balkans because there's never been a clear set of security guarantees to basically take conflict off the agenda. And you see that in the media all the time. It's part of the business model of the political elites here to keep that running. And in some places in the Balkans, we have clear security mandates, like Bosnia, but there hasn't been the will to make that a credible one. And Kosovo, too. The dialogue started because German troops were shot at, and Chancellor Merkel told President Tadic, you better figure out where your southern border is or you have no European perspective. That's how the whole dialogue got started. So the European Union has had an allergy to hard power. The presumption was the soft power attraction of the European Union through the EU accession process would force all these governments to shape up and meet those standards. I think we could see demonstrably that's not true from where we are now. So the question is, to the whole panel, is there a willingness to reassess the suite of policy tools the West has here to include deterrence, to take this conflict narrative that President Vučić mentioned this morning off the agenda, just to make it not credible, so you could force the topic back to the real issues rather than keeping this constantly open?
Well, if I was a panelist, I would answer no. But please, if any of our esteemed panelists feels like...
I'm not sure I understand what the gist of the question is when you talk about taking the conflict off the table. NATO is a consensus-based organization, right? NATO, when it enlarged, it did a number of things. It created norms. It created a set of expectations. It partly denationalized defense planning in the member states. It reopened the process, but it also was very highly normative, and especially in the 1990s trenches when it was happening. It became even more normative when the Membership Action Plan came in and the bolts were coming online and the rest of it. And I worked this pretty close, and I heard quite often people saying, well, you were so much easier with the Turks, and why are you setting these requirements? And my answer always was, well, that was then, this is now. It's a very different set of requirements. But the reason I say I don't quite understand what you're asking of us is, because you're setting a model in which, if I understand you correctly, and correct me if I'm not, that somehow we're supposed to insert NATO into the region, insert power into the region. That's not how the alliance works, and you know this perfectly well.
You want to follow up? I mean, I can give you like a short, maybe just a minute. Yes.
There are existing mandates here. U4, which is a Berlin Plus operation, and K4. And right now, those, certainly not in Bosnia, but I would argue also in Kosovo, those mandates are not seen as credible by potential conflict actors in terms of as a credible deterrent. If we were clearer about that, I think the narratives that you hear from the region would not get the traction that they do. That's my point.
So you're talking about increasing the size of the presence, right?
Yes, in a nutshell, and making clear that we won't allow these things to go forward, as some leaders are arguing that they could.
I don't. Well, anyway, I'll turn over to the ambassadors, please.
If there is a, please.
If I can maybe expand the question a little bit more to the entire region, I think that the security paradigm remains a fragile one, but we've in fact seen some significant improvements. With the membership in NATO of Slovenia, of Croatia, of Montenegro, of Albania, I think their security guarantees are much stronger, and therefore the idea of conflict from outside those countries into the NATO area is less conceivable, and their security is more secure. Similarly, if we can move forward with the Prespa agreement, which can lead to Macedonia also solidifying its position in NATO and beginning its process towards the EU, I think there's greater comfort level there as well. Your real question, as I understand it, relates to Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. And in the case of Kosovo, there is a KFOR presence there. I think that looked at the overall balance of forces realistically between the Serbian army and KFOR, you would see that KFOR in itself does not have the capability, but similarly, American troops in the Fulda Gap during the height of the Cold War did not, in and of themselves, have the capabilities to stop a Russian armored invasion, but they were an important tripwire which would have brought about another situation. And I think that that's pretty clear also to the Serbian leadership, and President Vučić has even talked about that in his public comments. So I think that there are pretty strong deterrent efforts already in place with regard to conflict between Kosovo and Serbia. That doesn't mean that things couldn't get out of control very quickly, and that's why I talked about the importance of moving forward and not keeping the status quo, because I think the status quo is unstable. Bosnia is another kettle of fish, to be very honest, and I think the weakest link in this process, and one where there are still unanswered questions and areas where I think people have to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michta. You wanted to follow up on that. Please. Yes? Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to add just a two-finger gloss on this because I was listening to this conversation. Today we look at NATO as it stands, right, and at the EU as it stands. And we tend to forget that 7 decades ago, the notion that the French and the Germans would cooperate was absurd, borderline absurd, right? So in addition to talking in terms of hard power, American presence, transatlantic linkage, there was a very important process of what I call the grand reconciliation between the French and the Germans. And you would not have had the European Union of today had it not been for really enlightened leadership at that time in Europe. And the reason I bring this into this conversation, because once again, I think it's very important that players in the region understand how great a burden it is on leadership in the region, in my view, just to use the example of what happened in Western Europe. When NATO enlarged in the 1990s, right, 1999, the first tranche, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, and NATO went to war right away, which even made it even more complicated. But the process that started then was the second grand reconciliation, which was an attempt to erase the German-Polish burden, the 2 base treaties that were signed at that time, good neighborly relations, no revisions of borders. I mean, these were foundational acts that then allowed for the European Union process to start working. So I fully agree with what Ambassador Scott said, that we have tripwires in place and they're incredibly important. And it had the Third World War happened, had the Russians rolled through the Fulda Gap, we would have to use, bringing back the troops and then fighting back and doing all of it. Nobody believed that we had enough assets in place to stop them at the border. But the reason why it worked was that there was also a cohesive community of nations, if you will, that was gradually evolving to the point that today, I mean, I'm sure the French tell terrible jokes about the Germans and the Germans tell bad jokes about the French. Show me the young French and German men or women who are willing to die over Alsace-Lorraine. I mean, they would laugh at you. It's absurd. So I would encourage you to also think not just in terms of hard power, and I'm a great proponent of realism, but also understand that you need to have leadership effort that works to actually adjust the historical grievances.
Thank you. I hope that first you have Mladen, then Milan, and Jelena finally, and that's all questions that we can take, I think.
Hi everyone, my name is Mladen Mrdalj. I'm a lecturer at a private college, small private college here in Belgrade, and most recently I was visiting scholar at Boston University. And I have a question for Mr. Michta. Talking about absurd things that used to be absurd but now are not, and talking about realism, I want to spice things up with a hypothetical question. Let's say Serbia applies for NATO membership on condition that it's not required to recognize Kosovo. It might hurt Putin's foreign policy credibility bad. Most certainly it would solve Bosnia's NATO aspiration, and I think it would contribute significantly to diffusing the military aspect of the tension between Serbia and Kosovo. Would you advocate for Serbia's membership in NATO in your own capacity? And this is a question for you because I think your answer would not be burdened with diplomatic burdens.
And you know the answer from me. Okay, good.
No. I just hope for a frank answer. So
I think you're getting frank answers across this panel. Look, when the decision was made in 1997, the famous not if but when, and when the study was released, Joe Kruzel at that time very famously said, that there are these 4 conditions that need to be met, and one of them was that you were not to have any sort of ethnic border conflict. I actually think the shrewdness of what Putin has done to Ukraine, for example, and to Georgia, is that because he has, in effect, created a low-intensity burning brush fire right now in both countries, he seized territory and he's ensured that as long as he is there, that conflict would persist. Then he has posed a horrendous dilemma for the NATO allies, because if you look at an organization that works by consensus and wants to bring in a new member, you're in effect voting for going to war, right? I mean, you're voting for a conflict with a nuclear-armed great power. I'm going to give you the answer that I firmly believe in, and you may think this is wishy-washy, and I'm dodging the question. The alliance is fundamentally not just about Article 5. The alliance is also about Article 2 and Article 10 to me, that it's a community of democratic nations, and there is no sidestepping that. The reason why things may get difficult with some of the allied member states right now is because that is a real concern. We're a community of values, and we also have the ability to collectively make a decision to invite new member states. So I don't feel comfortable with the kind of transactionalism that you seem to be positing here, if I understand it correctly, that if then, that maybe then. I watched very closely the changes that occurred in post-communist states. I remember my first visit to Romania in 1990, and to see where Romania is today. Poland in 1990, where Poland is today. Transforming your systems, seeking reconciliations, addressing issues that can resonate with the rest of the Western community, in my view, and I don't want to be preachy, but in my view, are fundamental not because they help you get into a club, but because they make you stronger. Consolidated democracies are not as susceptible to external manipulation, and this can be empirically demonstrated, as states that are riven by ethno-national conflict. If you go for big bore identity politics, ethnicity, national grievances, you can be exploded from the outside much more effectively than if you are truly, using the category of citizenship as your building block. So that would be my pseudo-academic answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have Milan now, Karsten, I almost forgot you, and then Jelena. Jelena, sorry.
Thank you, Marko. Milanic, German Council on Foreign Relations. 2 quick follow-up questions. One on the land swap idea, and you already answered that, but I want to come back to Albach Forum at the end of August, where it all started, because the presidents of Serbia and Kosovo in a panel actually started or set up the genie out of the bottle. And my simple question to you is, if you were notified by President of Serbia before Albach that something is coming. My second question is about and I think it would be a disservice not to ask it here, is about how concerned are you about quality of democracy in this country? I heard a story about how budget was passed in this country. And this is now a very good economic picture in Serbia, right? Very good economic growth, budget surplus, and still opposition was blatantly sort of cornered out of the whole debate and process. And this has echoed of Macedonia under Gruevski. And I just want to ask, what is your comment on that budget procedure in the parliament and some other concerns that you might have about democratic process and the institutions and the position of the opposition in this country now?
Can you just address the question to whom you are asking the question?
To two ambassadors.
Can we take now Carsten's question and then to have just another? Carsten, please. I want to give you some time.
Hello, my name is Karsten Friis. I work at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I would like to return to the transatlantic relations. Sorry about the feedback. I'm standing over here maybe. Because Andrew, you talked about, we should look beyond the Twitter feeds, as it were. But at the same time, there are real challenges. There are difficulties, disagreements between the US and Europe. Tariffs, climate change, Middle East, and now I just read that the EU is suing the United States in the world, the WTO. So, there are some clouds on the horizon that kind of undermines Western unity, as it were, which are real, I think, beyond Trump. So my question is, to what extent are we fearing that this will trickle down here? And the question goes to the ambassadors, actually. Are you fearing that there's a kind of growing divergence between Europe and the US when it comes to dealing with the challenges we're facing down here in this part of Europe? Thank you.
Please. Whichever order you find.
So maybe we start from the other end right now.
Okay. Ambassador Scott.
Three questions as I heard them, and the answers are no, yes, and no. As regards the Alpsbach discussions, I wouldn't have expected President Vučić to come to me before he went to Alpsbach to say what he was going to say. He's an independent actor, nor would I have expected President Thaci to do the same. The discussions and the public nature of the discussions were a bit of a surprise to me. But in any case, I think it was an important airing of views that helped also to stimulate debates in both countries, and that, I think, was valuable. With regard to the quality of democracy, I think that there are weaknesses in every country's democracy. But one of the key elements has to be based upon a parliamentary system which allows for open discussion of issues and a voice for the opposition. The procedural maneuvers that we've seen in the Serbian parliament, I think the European Union's report, most recent Commission report, also highlighted this issue as a matter of concern. And they've continued into this newest session of the parliament as well. And it's something that's an unfortunate element in the Serbian parliament. I guess we have to take succor from the fact that people aren't punching each other in the parliament here. But there's clearly more space for open discussion of issues of national importance, both in the parliament and in the national media. And I think that that sort of progress is going to be something that's going to be required as Serbia moves forward towards meeting the criteria of the European Union. And as far as divisions between the countries of the transatlantic alliance here in the Balkans, in fact, I've found that we work very closely and carefully together here in the Balkans, and I have not seen any reflection of any disagreements because we in fact share the same basic goals. The goals are to support the countries of this region in enhancing peace and stability, but also encouraging their progress towards the European Union. Thank you.
Very quickly, first question I think was don't have anything to add. Secondly, the state of democracy in this country. And to be fair, of course, this is still a very young democracy. Of course, there are a lot of challenges, and I think I said that the rule of law is very important also when it comes to the EU accession, and the better the reforms in the rule of law field, the reforms in the rule of law would speed up the EU accession process. So one can say it's actually up to Serbia, to the Serb government. If it speeds up the reforms in the rule of law, it will speed up the EU negotiation process. I said young democracy, a lot of challenges. We are following this very closely, but one can say, yes, indeed, progress is being made. One example, justice reform. We welcome that there were a number of public debates, but we are also this kind of. In our view, it is important to have a strong civil society, a strong democratic opposition, but of course this needs time, and we encourage the Serbian side to make progress as fast as is possible. Many challenges remain, and we are following the process very, very closely. And well, third question, I would also say we share the same goals. I would say we also normally share the same analyses, and so I don't see that there are any divisions or any in the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Michta, maybe the first question.
Let me just wrap it up, and Carsten, I'll just address your question because I'm clearly nowhere near an expert on regional politics that the two ambassadors are. Look, we live in a world right now which is in rapid change, rapid transition. I always tell my students that nations live in neighborhoods, and depending on your neighborhood, that's your security optics, that's how you see the universe. All European allies are quintessentially regional players. The United States neighborhood is global by definition. If you look at where we're positioned in terms of our military power, if you look at our security and strategic commitments that we've made, you could argue we're a continental island, we're a quintessentially naval power. The Europeans, except for the Brits, think differently. Your country is an exception here. We now are facing, after 4 decades of essentially migrating a large segment of Western technology to China, we're looking at a qualitative shift, not just in terms of the size of Chinese economy, but also at what the Chinese military will be able to field, how it's able to project power, how it's able to create A2AD areas, and all these issues are kind of coming to a head. When President Obama spoke about rebalancing to Asia, he was not trying to insult the Europeans. He was trying to address the fact that our principal security and strategic challenge was now emerging over there. In Europe, you have also a considerable amount of flux, but it's different. You just had the largest immigration wave since the end of the Second World War. The first one that came strictly from outside Europe. For the first time since the Völkerwanderung after the Second World War, you had a massive in-migration. I mean, this is my second tour in Germany when I arrived there in the summer of 2016, late summer. About 2 million people roughly went through Germany, about 1 million stayed. The consequences of such dramatic change, and it's not the size because Germany is a very large country, and Chancellor Merkel has absolutely right, and 80 million people can absorb 1 million people. But the question is how quickly, under what conditions, how ready are you for this? And your country is coping with similar issues. And the reason I bring these two examples, China and, for example, immigration, is that if neighborhoods define your security optics and your priority, then you will have a conversation within an alliance that's going to prioritize different areas. I once asked when I was speaking to a person from the Chancellery, you know, in the event there's a conflict in Asia, what would be a European position here? And she honestly said, I don't know. It's not that I expect the Europeans to go to war in Asia or do any sort of crazy things. I'm simply saying the priority of your focus is in a different area. Then look at the capabilities. I actually fully agree with the intent of what we're trying to do, what Secretary Mattis is trying to do, and President Trump. Europe needs to step up on burden sharing. This was mutually agreed upon in Warsaw, in Wales, in Brussels, and I think the Europeans leaders know that they need to do more. When you look at Vostok 2018, almost 300,000 troops, almost 1,000 aircraft. Trident Juncture in your country, 40,000 troops, and that's the largest exercise that NATO can do, right? 50, okay, 1,000 more, Mazel Tov. Right, and you look at what, maybe 100 aircraft or less, I mean, I don't know. So quantity has a quality of its own, and we have serious deficits across the alliance that need to be addressed. And I think this causes frictions, because depending on how you progress now through Europe, your country is a flank country, so are the Scandinavians, you know, even though they're not in NATO like the Swedes. You go to the Baltic states, you get the same sense. You go to Poland, you know, you get a sense that the key issue is Russia, it's the eastern frontier. As you go to France, what are you going to hear? Key issue is the southern flank. Why? Because Europe's border now is no longer on the Med, it's in the Sahel, it's in MENA. Africa has come to Europe, so to speak. And the countries like the Italians or the French who are exposed to these issues the most are looking in that direction. But my point, the larger point that I want to make is that none of this invalidates these differing security optics, priorities, and concerns, invalidates the fundamental strategic bond that is essential to the Europeans and to the Americans. And again, I will conclude with what I started. Don't listen to what people say in the media. Watch what we do. Watch the engagement at the military level. Watch the return of U.S. troops to Europe. Europe needs to rebuild logistics. You cannot be in a situation where it takes 15 days to move troops across Europe. Remember General Hodges saying, I need free access to rail, I need European Schengen when it comes to NATO. All these things have to be done, and I think we'll do it. We're doing it. What worries me in this conversation is that we tend to be looking inward and looking at our domestic political constructs more than we probably should for our own good. And I think that's where the leadership comes in. Because countries will, I think public opinions will support defense spending. They will come in to step up on defense if this is clearly communicated across the media, from the political leadership through the parliaments. So, thank you.
Okay, so, Jelana's question, and that would be it for questions since we are running out of time. Jelana, please.
Jelena Milic, Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies. It was really a very useful panel. But there was another panel this morning, Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, and a representative for German Foreign Office Department for Western Balkans has said that since the genie was out of the bottle, I think actually since we hear this new environment that maybe political West would be willing to hear what two sides can come up as some kind of a consensus, that nothing good came out of it, nothing good happened since, that apparently the situation, you know, turned backwards. Well, let me just give you a slightly different perspective. Ever since that situation became a mainstream, what we witness in Serbia on a local level is finally public support for the EU integration going up above 50% again. For the first time in several years, maybe even, you know, since 2003, we have popular support for NATO without any NATO campaign. God forbid, you know, on the contrary, being in 2 digits. And third, not last, the idea how significant Serbia-US relationship is becoming mainstream, and it is debated in places and among people that you wouldn't expect. I don't see any other significant political event that has happened in the last 6 months that I can attribute those trends to, apart from this new notion that, you know, the political West would be probably willing to understand and support if there is a compromise. So shouldn't these trends be counted for something, or should just they be discarded as nothing good came out of it. Thank you.
Anyone wishes to comment?
I think that was a rhetorical question, so
Well,
it doesn't require a
still.
response. No response.
Jelena? Probably not satisfied. Very well. If there are no more questions, I think that we have covered the field with some success. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists and to award them with a big round of applause. Thank you.